Everybody, Questwise here, and we're back again today with our series on the Vigilante Hack and Vigilante City that we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. And today we're going to be talking about villains and about how to create awesome villains for your worlds and for your campaigns. So if you haven't watched the first two, go back and check those out. The first one was on how to create cool heroes. And the second one was on how to create cool cities, or create the city itself, and how the city itself can be much of a character as your character actually in the game itself. This can be applied, any of these videos can be applied to sort of any kind of super heroic role-playing game that's out there. Heroes Unlimited, Marvel heroic super role-playing, any of the superhero games that you're playing. But most specifically, what we're going to be talking about is Vigilante Hack and Vigilante City. It's been produced by Bloat Games, and I will put a link to those down below. Vigilante Hack is out and available. Vigilante City is just successfully kickstarted and has a plethora of stretch goals that are being worked on right now that are coming out in the near future. So today we're going to talk about villains. What are villains? And we're not talking about just street thugs or mooks that you'll encounter, on an everyday basis. But we're talking about villains, nemesis for your player characters, and how to make them awesome as a game master. How to introduce them to your game and how to make them feel exciting and have a nice depth to them and stuff as well too. The biggest thing about villains is that they need to have a motivation. Villains always have some sort of motivation for why they're doing what they're doing, why they are opposed to the heroes themselves. Vigilante Hack, Vigilante City, again, if you haven't watched the previous videos, go check those out. But we're talking about street-level superheroes here. We're talking about heroes from down, we're talking like Batman, and we're talking Daredevil, and we're talking Punisher, up to a level about Spider-Man or so. And in that, we're talking about villains like Kingpin, or maybe even the Joker, Killer Croc, those kind of things. These kind of villains that oppose the heroes, but aren't just like everyday street thugs. They're not just going to be people that are in the way during a crime or during a simple session. We're talking about villains that are sort of always there in the background, always scheming, always bringing things on to hamper the characters themselves. So a good villain always needs a motivation. A good villain always needs a reason to do what they're doing. Just to destroy stuff, just to cause chaos, is a very weak motivation to add to a villain. Now, there are homicidal maniacs out there. There are people who seek to just destroy stuff. But in a role-playing game with an ongoing theme, especially if you're doing a campaign, for a one-shot, that might be great. Here's a new big bad guy for a one-shot that, just wants to wreak havoc. And that's cool, but after a while, it gets a little boring. True great villains, and you'll see this throughout the comic book world, and again, things like Kingpin, or the Joker, or any of these. Magneto has always been one of my favorite villains, although he's a little powerful for this game. But anyhow, they all have reasons to do what they're doing. So it might be something like trying to discover a cure for a loved one, which I believe was Mr. Freeze's motivation for a lot of things. It has a depth to it. It has some sort of reason behind it. The perfect villain, always believes that what they're doing is the right thing to do, whether it be for themselves, or for somebody they love, or for humanity at large. And that's going to create a very dynamic and awesome villain. So game masters, when you're sitting down and you're thinking about creating an overarching nemesis for your game, for your campaign, keep in mind that villains need a motivation. They need a tactic that's going to drive them throughout the thing. So when you're sitting down to sort of brainstorm about those things, use that as your backing force. Think about something cool, and then try to, of a sort of framework for the villain, but then try to figure out a way to incorporate a great motivation or reason for them to do what they are doing. Now, you don't have to do this right away. Early on in the campaign, the players, if you're doing an extended campaign, players might not even know about this nemesis. They might not even know about this big villain that's haunting them in the background. They might be just interacting with smaller villains, weaker villains, situations and stuff that you can use. And this is my next point about villains. Use what the players have given you to create your villain. So the big nemesis, and it's up to you really. You might even want to start your creation of the campaign itself with the villain idea, and then build the campaign around that. But you can also do the opposite. You can also start by just creating a small scenario and a situation to put your characters into. It might be everything from a carjacking to a drug deal to a mugging or whatever, and build from there. Let the players, when they're interacting with the game itself, let them give you clues as to what they think the big bad villain is. And in that, sort of build the villain's motivations from their thing. This is going to be another great way to make villains very interesting. If the villain is interested, if it has invested interest in the player characters, and the player characters have invested interest in the villain, it's going to make it a much more enjoyable campaign. It's going to make it much richer and deeper campaign setting by having that interaction between them. That there's sort of an invested interest in between the two. The other aspect you can do, sorry, I'm reading my notes here, trying to make sure I captured everything I wanted to talk about. One of the other things you can do too is that, depending on what the depth of your game is, depending on how rich your world is, or how in depth of scope you're going with your world setting. We talked about this before in the last video where we talked about the city itself. This kind of goes with the same concept, is that do you want to have one main villain, or do you want to have a sort of cast of villains? You'll see a lot of times that superheroes in comic books don't just have one main villain, but they have a cast of different sort of nemesis that they are up against. So Batman has a cast of different nemesis. They're all very, very powerful villains that all have different agendas and different ideas of what's going on, different cronies that work for them and such as well too. So you can start with that aspect of there being not just one bad guy, but numerous different bad guys or villains. Or you can just have one main sort of overarching nemesis that runs the entire thing. And this can be anything from like the Kingpin idea, where they're sort of like pulling the strings on everything. Or it can be much smaller sort of isolated groups like gang leaders is a little bit low on the scale for what I'm trying to reach at today, but that aspect, that there's different aspects of maybe the city. Maybe you've decided you want to do a large scope sort of city type thing, and that sort of each ward of the city or each part of the asylum has a different sort of nemesis that kind of pulls the strings and creates the crime in that area. I would suggest, if it's your first time playing Vigilante Hack or Vigilante City, that you go with a smaller approach. And we talked about this in the city video as well too, that you start with a small part of the city itself or a small town and sort of branch out from there, and let your players sort of build that as they go as well too. Feed upon what they're doing and what they're interested in to build a bigger thing. So I would again suggest that you do that here as well too. Start with one main villain, one nemesis, and then sort of grow from there. If you want to add another one later, like that one either gets defeated or it sort of just outlived its purpose or is just doing something in the background and you want to take the story in a new direction, to adding something like that later as well too. But villains, again, very important part of the game. Many different ways that you can sort of create them, many different ways to make them very interesting. So keep these ideas in mind when you're creating your villains and stuff as well. Come back next week and we're going to dive into Vigilante Hack a little bit deeper. And until next time, I'm Questwise, and we're out.